So we've already talked about counter-controlled repetition using both the while and for loop structures. We'll finish today off by talking about the sentinel-controlled repetition using the while and do-while structures. So sentinel, we can think of sentinels as things that watch and wait for something to happen. Sentinel loops will continue an action or some set of actions until a condition is fulfilled. And one of the most common ways that we use them within the scope of computer programming is to do input validation and verification. Before we go too far with that, we should look at what sentinel loops require. So sentinel loops require a sentinel value. This is some value that changes each time you go through the loop, and that and on whose change we determine whether or not to loop. We need a conditional that uses our sentinel value. Then we need something in the loop body to modify or at least to update the sentinel value with each iteration. And so here's this very small example of a sentinel controlled loop, wherein we ask the user for a number between 1 and 10, we collect that number, and then while our number is less than 1 or greater than 10, we print out to the user, hey, that's not correct, try again, and then we collect the number again. So we get our sentinel value, we check it using this conditional, and then if we need to, if our value is not correct, then we just update it as need be. We get a new value from the user, and we keep doing that until the user gives us what we want. And so here is a very quick example of that, wherein we'll create a scanner, print out a title, ask the user for a number, and then so long as that number is incorrect, we just keep asking the user for that number. And we've seen an example like this before. So do a quick compile, clear the screen, run it, and we'll say we do a -3, which doesn't work. We'll try a 0. We'll try 93. Also doesn't work. And then finally we'll try a 7, at which point everything should be fine. This is a really simple version of a sentinel controlled loop, and you'll see this on you'll see versions of this on web pages that ask for user inputs. For example, it might keep asking you for a password until your password is correct. It might keep asking you to input your credit card number until you input a valid credit card number as determined by the credit card number validation. And so with all this, we've got a sentinel controlled loop. Now sometimes with our sentinel controlled loops, a thing that we'll notice that we sometimes have to repeat lines of code. Right? So we might have to collect the user's input, and then if the input is incorrect, we do some output and then collect the input again. So we have to repeat these lines of code, and it's not a big deal here. But if our collection of input and or if the determination of whether that input is valid is a really complicated procedure, then we've got a little bit of work to do. When this happens, one structure that we might have that is very specifically designed for input validation is the do-while loop. And the difference between a do-while loop and a while loop is how the loop body and the conditional are evaluated relative to each other. In a while loop, your loop conditional is evaluated first, then the loop body is executed. So we check to see if our input is less than 1 or if the input is greater than 10, and if so, we execute all of that. That's the while loop. With a do-while loop, we execute the loop body first, and then we evaluate the condition to see if we should loop again. And what this means is that the do-while loop is particularly good for collecting and validating input, though it's not usually very useful in a lot of other cases. So here's an example of this. So we'll create our sentinel value. This is the user input number, and we're doing this because of the way that scope works. You have the do keyword. Then we ask the user to enter a number, system.print, enter a number from 1 to 10. We collect that number, and if the number is outside of our range, we output, hey, there's an error. Then we check to see, and if that number is still outside of range, which it will be because there's nothing between this line and the next line to change it, we go back to the beginning. We tell the user to enter a number, collect that input, check to see if it's outside of the range, and if so, we keep going. And we keep going, and we keep going. And the interesting thing about the do while loop is that that collection, that prompting, and then the collection of a number happen every single time, regardless, which means that these two lines of code, where we prompt the user and then collect that number, don't have to be repeated. Okay, so a do while loop. In terms of the structure, we start with the word do, D-O, then we open up our code block. From here, we'll prompt the user for a number, check to see if that number is okay, and then if the number is not good, we just keep looping with what looks like a really conventional while header. The difference here is that at the end of this we have to have a semicolon. That's the difference. With the regular while loop, we don't have to have a semicolon at the end, and in fact we shouldn't, because that'll break things. So if we look at this, in action, it is this section of code that's going to be the same as what we're looking for otherwise, wherein we check to see if there is a number. We ask the user for a number between 1 and 10. You collect that input, and then if the number is bad, we output an error message. And then we check again to see if the number is bad, and loop back to the beginning of this code block if we have to. We do the entire code block, then we check to see if we need to do it again. This lets us cut down just a little bit on repetition. So we'll save and quit, compile. Then we'll ask the user for a number. Let's say we go -3. It'll give us an error message, must be within the range 1 to 10. Then we give it 97, an 11, a 0, and finally we relent, as we should, and give it a 4, at which point everything is great. That's the joy of the do while loop. Now with the do while loop, and with the while loop, and with the for loop, the biggest thing that you are going to have to do is make sure that you spend some time practicing with these, writing these on your own, even if they're just dinky little loops, even if they are just very, very simple pedagogic exercises instead of things that solve actual problems. Take a couple of hours to practice with all of this. Is what that will let you do is ultimately make sure that you can write these without having to think too much about them. Okay. Now in terms of contrasting the while loop and the do while loop, with the while loops, we evaluate our condition first, and then if that condition is true, we execute the loop body. With the do while loop, we execute the loop body once, and we do that, that's the very first thing that we do. Then we evaluate the conditional to see if we need to keep looping, and if so, we execute the loop body again, then we evaluate again, we execute the loop body again, and so on up until our conditional evaluates to false. So long as the conditional is true, we keep looping. That's the do while loop. And we use this primarily for input validation. And as with the for loop, the do while loop is sort of optional. If you want to use a while loop for everything, for every single loop that you write in this class, that is more than okay. That's absolutely, absolutely, absolutely more than okay. Okay, so with while loops, you can use these anytime that you need to make a loop. Anytime, without any problem at all. The for loops should only be used for counter-controlled loops, for counter-controlled repetition. Anytime you have an action that needs to happen a specific number of times, that's when you use the for loop. With for loops, these are the sort of the default, by convention, structure for iterating over an array or some other type of collection, but that doesn't particularly matter. You can always use a while loop. Do while loops are things that you will only use when you are absolutely certain that the loop body should be executed one or more times, as opposed to if you're not entirely certain that the loop body will need to be executed at least once. And in this course, you should only really use the do while loop for input collection and validation. And even then, you can always, 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 always use the while loop without any real problem. The do while loop is just sometimes a little bit more compact. And so to conclude, now that we have the for loop, the while loop, and the do while loop, we've learned 3 of the 4 major loop structures for this class. The last one is the for each loop, which we're not going to use very often. in which we almost exclusively use with collections of objects. So we're not going to talk about that until April. But between the while loop, the for loop, and the do while loop, you have everything that you could possibly need to write looped repetition structures. And again, anytime that you are writing a loop, you can always, without any sort of hesitation, just use a while loop. You don't ever need to use a for loop or a do while loop unless an assignment or a quiz question requires otherwise. In the real world, if you only use while loops, no one will ever call you on that, unless they are someone who clearly does not have anything better to do. To practice, and this is a thing that I'd really like you guys to practice because I want you to be good at this. Take a look at the exercises at the back of chapters 3 and 4, as that will have practice exercises with loops of all three of the major varieties, as well as exercises that involve switches, that involve if statements inside of loops, that involve nested loops, and so on. It's vitally important to your success, both in this class and within the broader discipline of computer programming, that you take the time to really, really, really get comfortable with writing loops, and then later with using arrays and collections. These are fundamental. The analog here is that this is sort of like dribbling or shooting layups in basketball. If you can't dribble, you're going to have a really hard time doing much that's actually fancy. The basketball analogy might not work. A thing that will work, though, is conscientious, deliberate practice until you feel absolutely comfortable with it all. Okay, that's it for this lecture. Our next lecture we'll talk about the continue statement, the break statement, and about block scope, which is a concept that will become increasingly important as you write more and more complex programs. In the meantime, though, good luck working on your homeworks, and have a good day.